Hello everyone, today we make a reflection on some historical aspects, let's say, tied to self-development and broader issues at a political and social level. These are ideas that I have expressed already other times, right, and that I, however, still try to expand profitably for some further consideration. I didn't make much of these videos recently. I know some of you appreciate them. Says this terrain playlist is my favorite, and this for somebody that seems to be the case. As much as I see some maybe higher view rate when I make these videos, I don't understand why. Right? I understand, of course, the historical topics can vary. Let's say in interest for you, and that's normal. But sometimes I feel like I ramble rather too much in this videos, and that I may not even get to the point. The actual deal here is that I wanted, but I don't think I will, start a series, probably this small ones after all, about say fanboyism. Right? I can't help to stress. Of course, this would be some kind of not necessarily inflammatory, because I like to keep it, after all. Especially if I dedicate an entire video to the whole thing in kind of more civilized tracks than my usual references to what I think fundamentally certain ideologies are, and more than else explaining what is my experience regarding certain approaches that can vary from the ethnic. I thought that I make quite of an important amount of ethnic or national content, in the sense that we often make Indo-European history videos. We talk about specific polities in ancient medieval times. We also make broader considerations on the impact of all these in the present, right? And therefore it wouldn't be much to, let's say, to go against what I'm doing, but simply refining essentially the approach to these things, because I realized that, of course, as a YouTube channel focused mostly on medieval history, ancient history, and some sort of, in fact, ideal history, speaking of military and religious ideologies, and this moral dimension, and the ideal or idealistic, even at some point, Clausewitzian approach to warfare, which doesn't exclude the material side of the story either. This is important to stress. I realized that I unavoidably attract mostly people who are hooked fundamentally by the idea of, I come from this country, so I see this guy making videos about my country's history, or a country even that I think to appreciate in some, in fact, fanboyistic way, and then I subscribe, and I even listen to it. And in fact, what strikes me here, and sometimes through the comments, somebody actually opens up about their actual background and what they think, right? And as you know, there is often a mismatching that I spot between the points that I'm making and the overall comprehensive meaning of my work, and what people come here for, and what they think to understand of it, or what they derive from it, that they think they have grasped, they have gotten understood from my videos. And I find it dramatically fascinating for a number of reasons, right? First of all, because I like very much to approach reality from an ontological and gnosiological point of view. I often don't talk about this, but because mostly from one side I stress the necessity of evidence, right? So that's when I talk about. That's why I talk about history, because otherwise I could talk about more theoretical or even abstract points. But the channel is strongly anchored to a historical view, which I think, and I've explained to you, I presume to be the most effective to cure any real problem in the world. substantially, and so I believe that, of course, there are reasons for this. It's not it's just history per se, but it's the moment of the inquiry and what the meeting with reality that brings you to be skilled at that. There are so many things that in fact I would like to explain regarding this, even approaching other topics. At some point, I thought even to start a history of philosophy video series. I mean, and or there would be still history. As a matter of fact, it couldn't be just philosophy per se, because what is that in the first place? And secondly, I think that there is some need, in fact, to be more open regarding the direct implications that this shift between what I say and what is received, or perceived or understood. I don't know even how to to define that at some level, because I don't know what is going on in the head of the people that are saying those things, is actually crucial and fundamental for this country, for this this channel. I say this country, we immediately start with the biases and the lapses. What are we talking about? But it's important, right? It's important because, again, I could be just a storyteller, and yet the more you tell stories, the more you realize that there is something in the broader narrative that starts making sense on the basis of the evidence. And that evidence is the most important aspect of the whole thing. It's what I essentially try to inject as much as possible in my videos, so that, in fact, I realize the difficulty of that this presents with. Because if you come here just thinking that the videos I make are, say, just, data, pure data without interpretation, well, first of all, must tell you that's not history, right? And there is not such a thing properly like a unbiased history per se, right? I try to be objective, and yet, of course, I express some considerations that I don't think are subjective, because they come about in exactly in the moment in which I try to be objective, right? And that, I think, is the ones in which the greatest potential, not just for this channel, but in general for what history should be, and generally speaking, this broader reflections about the world actually lays in. And I could start from literally everything. Like, I could start, for example, given that we talk, in fact, a lot about ancient and medieval times, and I realized that I have a very strong let's say, amount of people who subscribe, mostly because they're interested in migration here, right? And there is a specific reason for that, which I understand, that we could start, for example, from the fanboyism deriving from all the possible ethnic approaches that you can think. It could be Roman, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, fanboyism. You would say, but, I came to this channel to hear mostly the stories of those peoples, right? You don't assume that I'm a fanboy, because I'm not, kind of, right? But the truth is, unfortunately, or at least with what it seems, again, because I get exposed to multiple, to an important amount of comments, and there, in fact, a pattern starts emerging from that, and it's not even something extremely negative, right? I mostly have people who are, in fact, civilized users, and then I'm extremely, in fact, delighted of having, like, my average commentators that, considering YouTube's average at least, that do not actually make mystery of this. They say it can be ethnic, it can be something else, it can be religious, didn't really have a big deal of atheists here. Probably the reason is that they don't feel the need to come on a medieval history channel, for example, has so much ecclesiastical history for complaining about, I don't know, Christianity. They just maybe listen to it, and they think they can extrapolate from it some kind of anti-theistic lesson, but still, of course, I don't leave any room for that. And the reason why they follow me anyway is because probably I deal with history of Christianity, if not in an unbiased way, because that I never told you whether I believe, not believe. That at this point, of course, I have a very positive idea of Christianity, and especially because that's there are many reasons here. I can't digress on why, and that have properly to do even the way this channel came to be realized, but say are separated from my point of view, or at least I don't tell you what my point of view is. And most of the reasons why I appreciate that I explain you in civilizational terms. I don't tell you that you have to be a Christian or you don't have to be a Christian. Simply telling you, look, that I've spent my amount of time learning about this stuff, and I realized that there is all that this thing happened because there were some issues that were resolved by this, and that that there were some long-standing benefits to the same civilization we live in, and that added an enormous depth morally and scientifically to it that it's impossible not to recognize as essentially a macroscopical and basically self-evident reality, which is interesting because you see, speaking from a conservative perspective, still I don't see I still see a lot of the progressivism, I don't know say this among conservatives. The opinion on the Middle Ages, Wu's opinion on the Middle Ages, for example, can vary dramatically, speaking of what constituted actual progress. Like classical liberalism would mostly think that that there is some sort of a dramatic, let's say it was a world of darkness until the Enlightenment, and everything then boomed eventually. And so because we got rid of religion, other conservatives actually understand pretty well what the civilizational and in fact enlightened role of Christianity, and more in general, also the this we're talking about general conservatives, of course, but I think that if you have any say education in history of religions from a lay institution, you know perfectly well that this is not a mystery for anybody, right? That these are not really opinions of commentators or political commentators or opinionists. This is really what we know, generally speaking, about how religions developed, and the negativity or the positivity of them. It's not even. It's a question that doesn't even make sense, right? This happened because it was the product of those realities, and of course, there were some important benefits to that, and so. In ways that today are essentially collapsing because other changes came in, but not necessarily because we have found a solution, or we have not necessarily because these changes are always to be in a progressistic sense, always positive. And this happened, in fact, historically, right? There were some moments in which, given that the entire world was religious at some point, you can see some moments of regression where also, of course, a religion participated to the broader civilizational trend, but that doesn't mean that, the presence of religion in itself or the role of religion in itself of what was doing at the time actually was a negative one. In considering the context, right? But very often in this regard, we have lacked the capacity to judge from, I would say, an objective point of view, but I would say probably from a historical point of view, probably from a real point of view, not what you think things in the past were, because you essentially came later, you have been biased by some, modernistic ideologies, and therefore you need to aggrandize your ego by presuming that you have accomplished anything personally just by expressing such poor judgments about things that fundamentally you don't have any education on. This is, in fact, the main issue that I want to talk about with you, because, again, as you know, I'm not a great fan of formal education in the way it is today, because I don't think there is one, right? Again, I don't, even in this case, I don't believe that the ideal and the what we have come up with so far is much of a problem, is the attitude of people towards it that has ruined everything and that has made the system collapse. And there are kind of evident dynamics even there that you can measure historically why this happened. And another one, the first one being actually another thing, one that most people just don't like to hear, that is essentially that with mass societies, we have surely, unlocked many forces and many possibilities and opportunities and so on, but at the same time, and we have read in an incredibly positive and progressive way, but we haven't had yet the courage, and this is something that we are maybe start seeing now with a limitation of voting rights that again towards which I frankly don't have anything against in principle. I see that both left and right are actually taking this in consideration. Of course, it's disturbing when this is weaponized in an activistic, propagandistic, properly ideological sense towards one of the two sides. I believe instead this is a matter of quality, some moral, scientific, universal standards about a person's capacity to have any political or social understanding to the point of having the right of deciding for others. Right? I'm not for necessarily banning people from voting. That would be probably the best, maybe the simplest way to do it. I've always dreamt some kind of license that provides you a higher or lower score that eventually will reflect in the sum of the votes. But it seems something a bit more Machiavellian, but still it would prevent, it would confer to some people, say, it would be difficult to measure that, but it would provide some people with the adequate. People in general with the adequate level of importance in their decision making at an electoral level, right? And so reflecting that in the political choices, and it could be something beneficial, right? Historically, this was the case. There is some responsibility deriving not just from the fact that you're a human being, but what you do with you being a human being, right? And how much you owe, for example, to the community, or how much you're capable of understanding the community. So it's a mix of factors. It's not easy, right? But it's important, and I presume it could really help stabilizing the system before everything crumbles, because it's evident at this point that the masses haven't achieved that level of competence or capacity or awareness that justifies their participation to political decisions, right? And this is obvious because the more, again, the younger and more inexperienced, more ignorant you are, and the more guarantistic you become, right? You say, well, I leave you the benefit of the doubt simply because I don't know yet, and therefore I keep others. Everybody should be free because simply I don't understand maybe that they're doing something wrong. Then when you start going on and you actually understand that there is something that really doesn't work on the grounds, not much of some individual, let's say, base, but on a dynamic that is even at least systemic and macroscopic and is causing a lot of damage. To the system, well, you want to start regulating this in a way that, of course, we already do, because we already regulated who can vote and who can't. We already regulated how people's rights are fundamentally granted, which ones they are, and so on. So it's not something that we haven't ever, let's say, or ever done, right? Who does decide that you can drive a car just banally? But there is an authority there that decided that, and we accepted that. And so it's obvious that historically, extending, universal voting rights, for example, it's been a positive thing in that specific context, because before that, there weren't the conditions for the new forces, moral and material ones, that were spreading to express themselves adequately, and yet they were a concrete element of society that was pushing the whole system further, right? In previous times, you didn't need that. You did need just an elite who essentially controlled the majority of the moral and material forces, and they were the most capable. They were the ones who knew how the system worked. The others were just not even practically even caring about having a representative right, or at least even if they had the possibility of breaking free, they would have not objectively had the tools and the instruments to build anything civilized, at least at the same level in which the current historical the current communities were working like, right? So what is happening now is that we have of course, improved dramatically in terms of, especially in mass terms. In fact, we live in a world that 200 years ago would have been completely inconceivable, and so we have dramatically enlarged the system, properly in terms of the kinetic energy that works within it. And one problem with that, as any physicist would know, is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to regulate, at least as the system has kept increasing. Of course, human communities have this incredible capacity, not just of not making everything fall apart, but also kind of developing in the process, not really in a progressive sense, but really mostly putting patches on things, in correspondence of all the things that that came out that they weren't prepared for, and that they managed to fix in a way or another. I mean, look at the pandemic, right? So there is that is factually how we find solutions in science. So yes, it's seducing to have the idea that there is the genius that is a bit of a romantic and dreamy individual that nobody believes, and instead has seen beyond already, and that's also kind of a problematic thing to do in the history of science, because you may never fully know whether that's the case, right? It's very interesting to study what certain scientists, aside from the liberal, progressistic, modernistic, in fact, picture that we have drawn of them, actually believed regarding the world of the time, right? Something that today we would find grotesque, but it's absolutely normal, right? It's just that we eliminate that dimension because we don't like, in fact, to admit this, that not only we are dramatically limited, that progress, if it ever happens, it's something extremely, born out of an extreme amount of sheer and failure and blood and tears and incapacity and stupidity and incompetence and irresponsibility, but that after all, and this is the thing you should recuperate in this, is that still there is something in our communities that makes things work, and then most of this are not scattered ideas that eventually manage to break through because they work, and so they become generalized, but because there are hierarchies and community structures that are able to make things, to keep things together and to bring them forward in ways that are also very, very, very fascinating, and that we have, again, seen because of many cultural biases, mostly with a materialistic bias, telling the truth, in the last, especially in the last, I would say the last century, last 200 years at least, they started more consistently, which is a huge problem because it seems that that mechanistic view has taken over the broader the broader mentality, culturally speaking, because this was a bit of an idea that pertained in a material sense, both, even if you look at the Cold War blocks, I mean, to both things, that like, the quality was a civilization was measured in how many washing machines you could produce, and not concentrating instead on the cause of that, so stressing on just the consequences, how much you could put out, but not the way it actually happened, which of course dramatically discounted the moral dimension, so that especially those who actually make a properly materialistic point in the guise of Marxism, especially in this dehumanization of reality, like also to say, look, because they were kind of doing it in a consumeristic, capitalistic way, the other side, but they actually weren't, because they weren't taking away basically the entire human dimension in a spiritual, sacred, and and cultural fashion out of the system. So behind, in fact, that superiority that eventually capitalism could boast, there was the dramatic moral superiority of a civilization that, of course, from the other side, didn't exist, and so the problem here is that, again, we have, however, still given for granted that achievement was obtained. Say, finally you have it, so we can buy you with it, right? That is actually also a way of civilizing. It's a way to, in fact, improve, or at least to measure a life quality improvement. There is no doubt, but without realizing, in fact, what was the effort and the discipline and the strength that brought to attain it. Especially what was the mechanism that, let's say, beyond even what the governments could decide, would bring people to put those enormous forces at work to actually improve their own quality of life, which worked, right? Because we live, in fact, in a world where this is exactly happening. So that's why the materialistic problem is so deep, because it's not much that we think that with material wealth, that we shouldn't think that with material wealth we could live better. It's just that we have simply erased the fact that there is something beyond that, right? And that still works dramatically better the wealthier you are, right? And so, and it should, at least. So what actually happens also from the historical, religious point of view, in this sense, is we find an enormous moral strength that was not even necessarily meant in a qualitative way, because, of course, this is yet another interesting idea. But to make it simpler, it's as if this great pressure that we had in the past because of the appalling living conditions and everything brought in people enormous moral strength. That, again, could even be directed to things like, I don't know, horrifying things, right? So genocide or anything. Think about World War II. It's still what produced that strength. That if it had been used in better ways, right, it would have actually brought an enormous benefit to the history, to mankind altogether. And that tells, by the way, already how much in mass societies the cultural education was stripped of the masses that, of course, didn't have it, because they had never had it, right? That there is not, it's a romantic myth to presume that just because people in the past were more, say, intelligent or capable in a way that, in fact, we constantly disregard, that this had necessarily to do with the quality of a human thinking, right? It had, in a way, but it's also the scale that was more reduced, right? You are surely not more intelligent or not more capable than a 7th century Bulgar cavalryman, right? But this doesn't mean that you're living a worse life than him, right? And this, again, didn't much come because what he was doing was just a pure spirit trapped into a terrifying world. It was just that he was a spirit coping with that terrifying world, and in a sense being part of the reason why that world was terrifying. And what happened, however, is that this enormous moral strength kind of collapsed in the moment to which the Industrial Revolution, mass society brought in this material wealth that satisfied great part of the needs of what people had at the time. Eventually, also the progresses the progress in medicine, in health conditions and so on. That, of course, as humans, as all beings are, once they lack pressure, they let it go, right? Beings are tendentially lazy, right? They tend to, if they're not stimulated, they tend to just to remain there. And yes, maybe having always the curiosity and the interest in chaos primarily, and to sort that out. But if they're not pressured enough, and kind of most of their immediate needs are satisfied, they may find themselves untrained in perpetuating the creation, at least the maintenance of a purpose that is what drives them morally, right? So what actually happens is that even in terms of intelligence, saying scientific capacity, we have dramatically increased, right? Let's put it in this way. Imagine these two lines, say, superimposing themselves. From one side, you have the moral one that falls down and the scientific one that rises up. And so basically, we live in this latter end where essentially, yes, we kind of know what the world works like. We have a very systematized, um, uh, let's say, education and understanding of the world, formally speaking. That is to say, every person now is one click away from learning literally what they wouldn't have the time to learn even in a million lives. But first of all, they don't care anymore. And secondly, not they don't care anymore because they don't have the purpose anymore to care, right? And so this thing should be from, especially from the top of our material wealth, kept alive, because if our ancestors, just even our grandparents, had been told what we have now, given the life that they were habituated to live, they would have probably immediately corrupted themselves too. Let's say on a if exposed, or if they had been fully integrated like us in this new situation. But surely, differently from us, they would have come from a background and say, wow, you have this stuff. You can do whatever you want. You can make an astonishing work. You can create everything. You can build so much. You can discover so much. You can be such a great mind and stuff. Today, we don't feel it anymore, right? You prefer to spend your life on TikTok. So this is an enormous issue, because it's not much, again, the fact that we have a particularly bad view of the world. It's just that we're not willing to learn it anymore, right? More or less, before, the world was simpler, so it was kind of easier to understand, at least in the essentials and what it pertained to the scale of possibilities that you could have, right? If you were a peasant, as basically the overwhelming majority of everybody's ancestors, all of our ancestors at some point were, it's not that you can do much. Basically, you have to spend your entire life just hoping that stinky plot of land that you barely can keep control of because of raids and famines and everything will give you enough to live for the next year. That's it. Like, it's obvious that you don't have an intellectual interest. What are you going to do with that? How's your life going to improve with that? That you can have the intellectual interest only if you are already part of an elite that lives in part of the surplus of what the society is able to produce, and therefore you can be nurtured in having the competences to manage better the system, to have, in fact, a higher moral training. That is something that comes to encompass properly the understanding of how things work politically and socially, so that by intervening here and that you can influence some processes and shift of these resources towards directions that you find more profitable. And so, a very complex system. And today, we are almost completely from the intellectual side, from the scientific side, let's say better in a more general sense again. But that will, that drive to make things work, to profit, to expand, to achieve, is no more, right? It's not that we have much today a problem that we are told constantly to achieve, because there is this great force that tells us anymore. Today, it's completely the contrary. There's nothing and nobody that tells people that they should actually break their backs because there is a superior moral value in being a more developed person. Nobody cares about that, right? It's just, measuring that maybe on some kind of material scale, what you own, and so measuring on that the fact whether you're accomplished or not. But nobody cares to say, you should be actually a more thinking brain, so that you are simply more powerful to use those resources to expand your power and your capacity and achieving further things that you are truly engaged in. There's really not. There is maybe this last idea that, feel, whatever you like, follow your dream, which is partly kind of, an important thing, because if you really are, if you really do we really do live in a world where there are lots of opportunities for an ever more diversified possibility of success than ever before. But because exactly, and in fact, okay, let's leave for later. But the question is that, first of all, dreaming is not quite knowing or being competent, whatever. right? So what people are encouraged to pursue this path is also, yes, but how, right? And again, for which purpose and for which premises? Because you see, if you fucked up completely your upbringing and your primary or secondary education, well, chances are that it's going to be very difficult to make it in this world. And so that's yet another thing that is dramatically overlooked, and sometimes also saying, but okay, we don't want to discriminate against these people because it's already too tough for them. Yes, but we can't really even flatter them, right, too much about it, because it turns out that the worst things that happen politically and socially are actually caused by these people. And so, first of all, of course, we don't want these people to be there, but we also have to acknowledge that if they want really to fix the world, they can't also kept constantly being fed by somebody who's just, victimizing them and pretending that the system is such an evil one that fundamentally has just brought these people down than themselves. It's a tragedy, right? And all these people should be helped in a moral sense, in a community sense. But at the same time, we cannot simply look away when they do something that is objectively and unjustifiably underperforming. Or even harmful, and simply saying, well, okay, it's all fault of those who instead succeed, right? It's not quite the case. It turns out it's contrary, because most people that succeed are actually the ones that provide for other opportunities for these people actually to join in, to have a life and improve themselves. And this is widely recognized, because people who actually work, understand this quite directly. And the trick here is trying to essentially, for the big corporate interests, to tell somebody, look, you can live your life as long, I can maintain you with an incredibly low, with kind of a wage or something, so you will not have to think about anything. You can simply spend your entire life without doing anything, or doing maybe that few that you don't feel pressured by. So something that, again, for our needed moral capacities today is not going actually to bring any substantial benefit to the community, and I will have to deal with all the rest. And so don't worry if I start essentially dictating what you have to do, or to believe, or to be on my side. This is a kind of a dramatic situation that we're witnessing. It's somewhat predictable. By the way, it was predictable, especially after great expansion, cycles. Normally, this is what happens with the crisis and all. We are seeing it very well, and even here, the real problem is not material; it's moral, right? Those people fundamentally are not just unaware of the possibilities that they are, but even when presented with the opportunity of change, an improvement in that sense, they shut down. Because again, they are that, it's just more than being lazy, right? And not wanting to accept, in fact, what your limits are. It's probably being paranoid. And paranoia is always accompanied by essentially a denial of reality, or an incapacity to look at reality, right? And so it's unsurprising how also history, so the only scientific way that we have factually to depict reality in its complexity, because all the other subject branches fundamentally describe a narrow part of reality and do not attempt to have this broader kind of explanations of how this more political, military, and social dimension actually work, because they already contain everything, both the moral and material disciplines, because we see real people in action in history. We're not just studying from a psychological point of view, as a psychologist would do. We're not just studying it from even just a material point of view, or even how this mechanism, the market works, or what's engineering about, or even something that can take a more abstract dimension than that. And so we are essentially eliminating even there. Why so? Because we lack the effort to consecrate ourselves to the inquiry aimed at spotting exactly where we are in this broader system, and we would prefer just to sow on ourselves our preferred kind of made up, unscientific, immoral identity, because of course we lack any moral or scientific literacy at that point without knowing the world, and becoming hysterically paranoid and even violent and incredibly easy to manipulate, even in a violent way. If anybody tells us, look, that what you're doing is sometimes properly wrong, other times properly, you leave completely alienated from the world in ways that are dangerous for you. And that's why I say, oh, I should make a video about this, a video about that, because I got interested very often in even the history of and properly actually in talking about people from specific countries in the world, observing this spectrum, say, of this kind of degree of alienation, and I have come to the conclusion that, again, we're mostly flattering ourselves for reasons that are as obscure and as interested and kind of, in fact, even concealed as you can think, just to hide reality, that we're not all equal at all, right? This shouldn't be a surprising fact for any morally and scientifically educated person. But this is actually what most people today in the world are brought to believe, because, again, all these masses that have been unchained, right, through actually most of the times a very virtuous, let's say, positive action of granting them access to material wealth, have also, however, been often done this in a way of control. Say for the sake of controlling them, because of course, if you are the dispenser of that wealth, you are interested in doing it, and of course you don't have a full control on human beings, because again, nobody can control somebody else's mind. It's factually impossible. We don't even know how the mind works. But it's obvious that if these newly civilized masses are brought to these new levels of opportunities, and they literally come from a past where basically they have no past, where they don't understand even where they come from. They have no historical awareness. They were simply from masses that never had any kind of literacy, an appreciable literacy at any level. You can way more easily influence and manipulate them, making them buy basically any kind of bullshit that you want to feed them with. And again, as far as I'm concerned, of course I have a moral problem with this, but by a certain degree it's always more the fault of that individual than those who are actually just letting them freely engage into something that, yes, seems to be objectively convenient, and therefore that there is really anything wrong in it. It's just they don't understand it's, however, mostly aimed at not making them profit, but other people profit. And again, I don't think this is moral necessarily, but I also believe that it always starts from the individual, and so you cannot really whine and blame the world too much if you fall into in a condition that you actually built yourself around you, which is, I presume, the in the superiority of idea over inanimate matter, the correct, where the balance is shifted in favor of that. That's actually the correct explanation. And of course, there are lots of people who find themselves in dire straits not because of their fault, right? This is true at many levels. This is not just true, at a socio-economical level. This is also true terms of mental illnesses. What are mental illnesses, for example? Do they happen because of what you think like, or do they happen because, you were born just with an imbalance in your brain chemicals, or at least something that would. It's always the both of them. And I'm saying even in here that there are mental illnesses that are, say, we call them disorder at this point, not to stigmatize saying you're ill, but factually most of the disorders that we're witnessing today, and even the fact that these disorders are medicalized by a certain degree, is actually not a scientific achievement. It's just a kind of a lack of moral understanding of the world, so that every kind of failure and shortcoming and saying, I feel down, I can't handle this, etc. It's not much because you have a mental illness slash disorder, but because you're not adequately aware of the world, because maybe literally you have never made an effort to understand much, and thus you haven't quite built a moral backbone to do anything in your life, and therefore you are dramatically weak in front of anything that is happening. And this is happening really to, it's not just happening to people that, I don't know, have disorders or whatever. This is happening really to everybody, in the sense that the epidemics of such mental disorders that we're witnessing in the last decades is of unprecedented scale. Right? There are some implications here. People say, well, it's actually also maybe because people are more aware of the deeper implication of things. Yes, that's one reason. But if you that's a scientific problem, right? And that is correct. That brings surely to a comprehensive awareness where people are not just, can't be just even oblivious of the world, right? So there is an increase in that. But speaking of the moral capacity to resist to this, that actually derives to the fact that people have never been exposed to too many hardships that their parents or their grandparents actually would have just gone through without too many problems. How many kids today actually bail out from any kind of specific activity or commitment or life project just because they haven't been properly taught to understand why those things matter in order to develop themselves, while their parents were, I don't know, willing to work, very, very, very heavy rates for all their lives and never posed. They were aware of having worked somewhat hard by a certain standard, because also compared to their parents, maybe they weren't already. And so the cycle continues, but that wouldn't even complain about that. It was normal. Everybody worked in at those levels. Of course, there were sometimes more opportunities for that, but still the individual commitment to that work was higher than one we see today. So what I'm saying here doesn't sound contradictory, because what I'm saying is that albeit the scientific awareness of the world has increased in absolute terms, this is not is incredibly lower in relative terms than in past times, relatively to the understanding of world mechanics for what they were, right? It's being exposed to the world that in a way we understand much less than before, and that in this sense we're understanding, we're awakening. I hope there's going to be an improvement in this sense civilizationally towards the direction of being individually and satisfactorily educated to understand how to make it work and how to keep it together. Because the boom that we have witnessed in the last several generations has been so great that, again, we've been projected at hyper speed into a world that fundamentally it's so complex that we haven't still found the cultural structures to frame it, the scientific, in fact, moral capacities to frame in a positive way to handle it, right? And so the pressure that we fear now also derives from the fact, of course, the much greater forces are operating in this world, but they are in absolute terms, but we are less able to control them, right? Paradoxically, the world made much more sense to somebody living during World War I or World War II, in spite of the unspeakable massacres and genocide, etc., and this idea of a world overthrown, than we do today, right? It's a typical phase of moral disorientation towards what is going on. And I give you, it's not even that simple on the grounds on, whisper seeming this, for example. And it does have, let's say, it's complicated by the fact that normally in history there are certain dynamics that are kind of more of a longer run and kind of more evidently connected to certain protagonists or not. Like as we see often in history, there is one people at some point takes over because has the kind of greater force and is able to substitute its elite or to hybridize its elite to a more decadent yet developed place, and then it's mostly balancing and kind of building a state. Today, we don't see this anymore because also the cultural tools that we have mismatch the reality, right? Many people say, "Oh, we are coming back into a pre-Westphalian world." With all the due caution, yes, it's kind of that. I don't like the term and the expression because I don't believe that there is anything like that there has ever concretely been, if not by some wild approximation, something like a pre or post Westphalian world, nor of course we're coming back to what was before, and still again we haven't fully acknowledged the implications of this. Also because I'll tell you what, that from a scientific point of view, I tell you all the time, the I'd say the capacity of having a synthesis view of the world, and having people who are educated to make a comprehensive understanding are not present, right? We are hyper specializing, and as a consequence, it's as if we were becoming blind and deaf to what is going on, right? To a dynamic that to somebody even living, a couple of years ago, if they had a couple of generations ago, if they had been told what was going on, they would have easily kind of identified a specific, it's not that they would have understood it better than us, but they would have immediately said, okay, so if this is happening, it's obvious that we have to take this action, right? And today, instead, it seems that that idea is right in front of everybody, but nobody, again, has the moral drive to say, okay, so shall we do it? And the world at this point is ravaged by those who are able to seize the initiative. That most of the time it's not people that are actually more more capable or more, in fact, commendable in a cultural point, from a cultural point of view, but it's still maybe are the new barbarians that will take over another decadent world that hasn't understood that it's not just about getting to the alleged moment of progress and of happiness and so on, but that it takes at that point to keep pushing forward, even with greater energy, moral energies than before, right? So just look at the fact of how the objective seems to be happiness in our world. Basically, we have decided that everything that revolves around our own emotions is all what we should believe in. So out of yourself there is nothing, and this is one of the greatest. This is properly formulating the end of the moral dimension, because and if you forget what the importance of or the role or the meaning of sacred is in a world, and there are different ways in which this is being seen. Historically, there's been an important and even a process of secularization where it's kind of more identifiable what it is, but it's not that today people that on average understand anymore what's the implication, for example, of secularization per se, right? They either think that you're talking about the fact that religion was better because maybe you're a bigot, or you're just like a believer, and they believe that instead it's just about science, as if it without even having any kind of scientific education of sort. And not factually understanding what they're talking about in this sense, not understanding the moral and scientific implications, in fact, of this system, so why did it happen, or what is that, again, even in this apparent progress that we've been fed with like a narrative, we have lost that we actually would make pretty good use at this point with the new positive things that we have acquired. Or they think secularization is substantially some sort of, yes, they understand the idea of loss of purpose in a ideal sense, but they have factually forgotten what that purpose substantiated itself on, right? In fact, is the example that we were making before. In our prevalent culture, it seems to be that the purpose of things is, again, gaining the greatest kind of amount of material resources, and therefore if those exist, everything is fine. That may be true if, let's say, of course, we appreciate, again, the fact that human beings always know how to put themselves at work with the resources that they have. But again, if you do not account the amount or lack of more of pressure in the first place, you cannot even pretend that the moral force necessary to put those resources in action is going to be satisfactory in order to cope with the new challenges, because these challenges are more subtle, they're bigger, they're on the longer run, they in this sense are also less predictable, and therefore it's not even a matter of saying, okay, so we should have ever more let's say ever quicker ways to cope with that we can even just mechanically solve with improving this or that technology, but it's properly realizing what happens, having the courage of investing beyond market, to say in something that, in fact, it's a risk to invest, but that if you get right, you will have found yourself at the end of the day with a civilizational structure that is able to bridge you, in fact, from here to the future in a way that eventually can help other people too. And this is the obvious inherent risk in market, right? It's just that this is the point, that you should be able to have a moral dimension that reaches far beyond a market, say, the scale, and being, again, a double person beyond that is again what seems to be dramatically falling under any point of view. And again, this may not be, you see, this is happening worldwide, so again, this may not apply to some. Of course, there are people who are doing it the right way, right, and probably are going to be very, very successful in that sense. But I've been impressed even but still, even in those environments that seem to have gotten the formulas right in a sense, and especially still care about certain civilizational structures and hierarchies and so on, how few and how mechanically and materially they measure these achievements, which is always the greatest challenge. I mean, in the moment in which you realize that you factually don't know where your life will go, whether you're going to succeed or fail, and actually that the chances of failure are very high, you can't build that moral backbone, and therefore when you will be shattered eventually by whatever is going to happen, you will be broken. It's a very difficult thing, because you see, all of us, in a way or another, are discounting something, are approximating our world our understanding of the world in ways that we say, well, okay, we even recognize that maybe we lack that specific aspect or capacity or understanding, but we say, well, okay, maybe it's not so important, maybe I will manage to compensate in the meanwhile. And instead, what is going on is only, you becoming ever more tunnel visioned and kind of, in fact, alienated. And this is also normal by a certain degree, right? It's normal to, at some point, to be ever less able to change, and to, especially with age, and to, at the end of the day, even contenting yourself with what you have and seeing things in a even more correctly in that risk assessment way, to say, okay, there is a moment in which I should content myself, but still, you are kind of knowing that you could have done something better, that you could have achieved more, that there is something to this all that somewhat deserved a greater participation, a greater commitment, even to the risk of your life. May seem strange, like, I don't know if you've ever, let's say, found yourself in one of those situations in which you say, what it would take to solve this problem is completely crazy, and the only reason why I'm not doing it is because I fear to lose too much, and kind of at the end of the day trying to distort reality to say, okay, but maybe that thing I cared so much about was not so important. And so actually living for the rest of your life with this doubt or with this lie that maybe at some point you will wake up and say, wait a minute, I could done that, it could bring that to the extreme consequence, and I didn't do it because I was just, in fact, too lazy, right? I was too much of a coward. I was simply, like, why didn't I even do it, right? And sometimes they can be even very normal things. Sometimes it can mean taking a plane ticket, and having the courage of exposing yourself maybe to a temporary stress or to some kind of risk that can, of course, make you suffer further, but that will make you have said, okay, well, I've done literally everything I could to solve the issue. So you would say, why am I making this video? Well, there is actually a point to this video you would be surprised to hear, which has to do with the let's say with the realization that at least from what I receive here, let's say it's not even about Schwerpunkt, let's be honest, it's about what I see all around. In a way, there are many things that are happening nowadays, even worldwide, that make you realize that, and how this kind of sleeping passivity and laziness and lack of interest can bring to it. That makes me realize that, especially the youngest, that are those who are actually designed to get that kind of that dramatic moral drive towards reality in order to make it work, and that are eventually at some point going to be too old to let's say to fix the situation if they haven't in fact dared enough at that point, are completely deluding themselves with ideologies that I don't even know where they learn from, but that seem to be driven by this incredible cowardice and lack of of interest in reality that bring them to actually believe in nothing, or at least in things that are evidently wrong, that are evidently dysfunctional, and that are especially not making any effort to get any historical base in that sense. Because again, when I say historical here, it's not just to study history strictly meant. It's properly getting historical in the measure in which everything that we can measure about reality is historical. So, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, I was thinking about making a series but I'm not convinced about it, because I think it could be too much, like, are you targeting me or anything? But it could be interesting. It could be about ethnicities, as we were saying before. It could be about theistic or atheistic views. It can be about political views, the whole spectrum, from Nazism to fascism, to socialism, communism, and kind of shaking this kind of, and describing mostly what I think the not even the single ideologies are, because that would be even easier to do, because it's not even about the fact that certain worldviews are wrong on any, in fact, real base, but it's just that they are somewhat contradictory in themselves, and the diversity of their interpretation and the various currents, and just whatever we know, just banally from a scientific point of view, from a from evolutionary biology, from lots of things that, in fact, older systems were dramatically more in line with, compared to this new interpretation of the world would show, are actually the product of a personal delusion. that you can easily track, especially when you study history. It's not to say, I got you here because you think this historical thing was in a way. No, I have to lecture you about the thing it was another. It's really a psychological thing, because you understand, especially these kids that buy in these ideologies, that they are complete, like from even the way they write and what they present as some kind of proposal, not even as just not even as a criticism or a correction or expression, but pretending that that is a point. Sometimes you understand that they're people with difficulties, that they have problems, that and these problems are self-evident, that there is something seriously wrong going on with their lives. So it's not much about, again, making history videos telling them, look, things are not the way you do, because of course they have an ego and a pride that you don't want this to destroy. But let's say they're not interested in that. They're not interested in having in engaging in a real inquiry. They are just saying, look, I am desperate, so I will throw out this provocatory idea because I think that, somebody maybe somewhere has the answer. I don't really understand it, but it will do. Because I don't know, I come from a family where they believe this, or I heard that guy, or I read this thing on the internet on it, and you realize that the misery, in fact, the moral and very often also the material misery of these people, to pretend that they have a point, not in about history, but in their lives. And this is, again, the greatest illness that we're facing. It's a literal epidemic. And there are, again, reasons that are of major force, right? That in order to push a person to fall into these delusions, you must come from a background where you really have severe problems, and it's so easy to understand it, even just looking at the historical point they make, right? If you easily see what the historical point they make, plus you sum the country where they come from, you already got it. You already understand everything, right? There is hardly something easier than understanding somebody's political point by understanding by hearing how they express themselves historically. Even the most stupid things, the simplest phrases, you can immediately understand that. And secondly, if you know where they come from, you can draw there the whole picture, even properly from a comprehensive psychological point of view. And that's severe. I mean, I give you, sometimes you don't understand completely everything in the form of, let's say, because you wonder whether they may knew something more. Very often they don't, right? So you don't even have, you can make yourself the scrupple, because you know that what you don't see doesn't mean that it's not there. But therefore it becomes even easier, in fact, to spot where the limit is. I've measured this over time, because I've had, sometimes people maybe following me for years and still not getting something that I was saying all the time. And at that point I wonder, again, is it possible, is it this person is not capable of understanding, or is it that they maybe understand but they just don't care, because what they want to express is just their personal, the fact that telling to the world that they are meaningful in some way. I believe it's the latter, right? I believe it's a form of loneliness or solitude. And I must tell you this, that for a person like me that has always liked to live, that always appreciated solitude, has always been, and never looked for guides or company to feel accomplished or fulfilled, that history provides you with all of what you need, not in a really substitutive way in those things, right? That depends sometimes in the way we are calibrated from a moral point of view. I also have, for example, I have very low in extraversion, and very low in agreeableness. And this also causes me problems, because that's a good predictor of neuroticism, as a matter of fact. And part of the reason is that, of course, if you spend too much time without a direct interaction, it can happen. But there is also, for example, extremely high in openness and in conscientiousness, which means that sometimes I pose myself this problem, which is the following: am I like inadequate for other people, or other people are inadequate for me? Right, that's a bit of a challenge to answer. I realize, I can tell you, there are many lonely people that follow my channel. I understand that, because they're very often people with mental disorders of some kind. I really never had, maybe just in the last year, for some of you have known, I've had I've had an anxiety disorder at some point. It was triggered by a very specific cause, but the reason why this was caused, again, it was not just a mere I don't know, I was exposed to pressure and therefore I felt like that. It was something more important. It was about how this wired with my well understanding of the world, and I started to pose myself that question. And I realized that there are ever more people who are posing themselves that question, because the same reason why we can't find purpose, and we can't find and we can't, even when we search very hard for it, and we can't just say this thing won't work, and we know that, is the cause of it all, isn't it? Right? It's not that today, you see, there are some political sides that ride this wave of nihilism and of, that want literally to tear down morality, science, hierarchies. So basically, what defined the superiority of human beings and their deepest nature, and the great of the greatest sap of human civilization, because of course they don't care about people, and they just care about extending more power on them, and they actually even succeed in some ways. But it's about people, normal people, or maybe are ideologized in a way or another. We all are, right? We are either left or right. We have our ideas about God, whatever. But it's not that we are actually just complete, like we believe that there is no point. Actually, the reason why we are frustrated in that way is that we understand that there is a point, and that we're actually struggling to understand it better, and that there is, in fact, a way to do this. I tell you, I found it in history, but not as an option really, but rather as a necessity, because I don't think you can find it really anywhere else. I mean, you can be aptitudinally very, let's say, again, very capable in a very specific task, in a very specific work, in a technical craft, in all things that can really make you feel well by working with something, and yes, but there is still something you're longing for. There are I don't know, think about Narcissus and Goldmund, or these other beautiful novels that reveal you how it's not really it's not just one option or another. It's not even just a matter of dichotomy. There is only one way, right? And this is what any mentally health and morally objective person should come to the conclusion of, because it's obvious that as far as reality is concerned, we can have two different opinions, but it's obvious that one is better than the other, and that the reality is the answer. And so when you study history and you try to make sense of bigger systems and so on, and of course I should expand not so much in order to be credible in even what I'm saying, but that is a way to spot that objective point, right? And so it's something that you cannot really live without, in my opinion, if not remaining always in an appalling, especially moral misery that is really the worst thing. Again, you can have everything materially, but feeling completely nothing, right? It's dramatically easier to be a better person by having more material resources. There is absolutely no doubt of this. All the greatest civilizations in history were superior because they were dramatically morally driven, but also they had a material base in which they could operate, right? But the moral dimension is more important because, again, the material thing can also be seized, but it won't do anything by itself. So it's all about how driven you really are. And that precedence, in my opinion, is what we are somewhat denying, that there has always to be a balance, that you can't always be like a prehistorical Indo-European hero that just thinks that, every action has to be perfect. And because at the moment in which, of course, any action you will take obviously won't be perfect, what do you do? Do you hang yourself because of that? Because you think that glory will never descend with its wings on you? At that point, it's obviously a compromise. But still, again, is how far can you reach? I personally found a way to motivate myself in that regard through history. I don't know how strong this is. I still think I'm not particularly strong, that I'm not particularly, there would be so many things that could shatter me in irreparable ways at some point, but even given me a greater tremendous boost. And we all have this end of the history illusion for which we think we cannot change. But as a matter of fact, we are biologically designed in our genes to change as hell, and adapting to the situation. Because again, when our genes were molded, our ancestors were under the most radically traumatic, violent, and unspeakable conditions that you can ever imagine. And in fact, the fact of living the way you do, because I don't care where you come from or what was your background, it was nothing like the one that we went through, evolutionarily speaking, should make you reflect a bit on what you're doing with your life. And so to realize that it doesn't matter how hurt you are, how down you feel, whatever, that there is a way, and that way begins with actually believing in yourself, but believing in yourself to do something, not to believe in yourself in a narcissistic fashion. You say, well, I'm just super cool, man. I identify with cool, so you have to recognize me like that. And whoever doesn't, I will kill myself because I have zero moral, resistance to that. It's exactly what it's come to the point at this point. Right? And the problem is people. The problem is people who also let other people pretending that, right? There is a difference between being good and being right, right? I would prefer being right and, being hated by everybody, that, being good with everybody, but letting the world system collapse. Because basically I would have created indirectly, at least for what I'm concerned, from my part in the system, just, something that tends towards a slob. And so I love to struggle in that sense. I don't think that there is anything wrong in suffering, as long as, of course, it's tolerable. But the degree of tolerability depends exactly on how more you expose yourself to the limit, right, and how much you want to do. So, on the other hand, I realize also that I was a dramatically lucky and privileged person. And again, I don't think there is anything bad with that. People should be proud to be privileged and spit in the face of whoever thinks that anybody should touch anything that we have just because of that. Because most of the times they don't come from a moral standpoint from which they have any human decency from which to speak from. But we are exactly the ones that are chosen to do the greatest, and that just like say other people don't, right? Because you can, again, in proportion, we are the ones we're called to make the greatest effort. And so just thinking that makes you realize how much more driven you should be. And that's what the elites in the past were. The elites in the past were rich people for which lots of people broke their backs in the fields for. And that very far from being a parasitic class were the people who held the whole freaking world on their shoulders from a moral point of view, who went to war causing, with the most radically unspeakable responsibilities that you can even remotely dream of, and proving that with a moral superiority that today is completely unmatched by our elites. And we feel this, right? Because again, from the peasant, you couldn't expect that much. As from the average worker today, you can't expect that much, right? So this really depends on the elites, and it depends also on the elites that are going to be formed, because some of this despicable moral decline that happens today didn't quite happen much because those who rose to power violently were because they were oppressed were better people, or had a better understanding of the world, or a greater capacity, but we're just more pressured, and fundamentally the elites let power slipping from their hands because they were at that point become too soft themselves, right? So every political situation has a balance, right? There is nothing deterministic about reality. It's not going to happen. Let's say you can spot this broader mechanisms at some levels when things have already happened. At the moment, you can't really tell, right? Many revolutions, the most famous historical, but were not meant to happen. There was nothing deterministic about that. There were surely some changes that would have been triggered over time, but the way even just the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, they didn't have to happen minimally, right? And of course, those who are ideologized in that sense think that they had to happen somehow, or that they were unavoidable, unnecessary, even moral, or even there was something, I don't know, metaphysical about that. But there is, in fact, just by studying history, no evidence of that, but instead an overwhelming evidence of the fact that there are people who at some point are paralyzed, and they are paralyzed for reasons that we can never fully understand from their standpoint, but that are quite easily understandable on the grounds of how much are you willing to sacrifice in order to maintain what you have. And if the you have so much but still you don't know what to do with that, there you will lose it to the barbarians. You will lose it to those who are even maybe normally the people are incapable of change, right? They are just led by somebody else, right? But this somebody else is not necessarily a better person, right, for the community, or it depends really, because there are some movements that really eventually take a radical direction. There are some changes that instead are much better managed, and so they have also much better results in a much more constructive way. But in fact, it's always about a change that is always happens, because societies are changing all the time, right? It's not that there's a moment where there is a situation and it crystallized and that's basically it, and so you shouldn't see anything anymore in that regard. But the difference between dramatic, violent, disruptive, counterproductive, damaging change and the way of a healthy change, a healthy control of our resources, etc., is factually in your hands. It's nobody's. You can't look at historical phenomena by saying, this somewhat doesn't depend on the person, on the single individuals. Of course it did. There is not some outer force operating in the world out of people's minds, or at least of any other conscious being, like in the idea that, again, things are not meant to happen unless people make it happen. In a way, moral forces fluctuate is amazing. And secondly, we still, in fact, don't have much of a clue on how to measure it adequately, if not studying history, right? You can almost feel this kind of difference, because it's actually the difference that you start feeling yourself when you realize the difference you can do by having just another attitude, right? Even now we have abandoned temporarily the Von Krieg series, but just by talking about warfare, and we will resume that, by the way, and in general about strategic culture, it's that you know how nefarious it is, how to leave the initiative to the enemy, right? The first attitude is not just by winning through logic and arguments. that is, of course, very powerful if you have a certain environment where you can afford to measure, to regulate these matters also by showing off that way, right? And so that moral consequences can definitely favor you and bring you to, even bring it to a very large scale. Just think of how powerful it is with the means that we have at our disposal today, just social networks and so on, and how difficult it is to regulate that. But it is also a matter of, in fact, having that moral strength. It's saying, because you see, moral strength just doesn't come like, showing muscles in front of logic and reason. It's actually the same thing. It's because if you're driven by something, it's your mind that starts that. So it's your mind that has to convince itself in a way or another of the validity of your points, right? And it's obvious that there are kind of more tumultuous forces, etc. That where you're younger, you're more prone to risk because you just don't even know what the price of defeat or things like this. But let's say believing in something depends on how much sense the thing makes, which we don't really teach people to be capable of anymore. The logics are becoming ever more dimensional, right? At the point we are able to engage into radical moral subjectivism, pretending that just because something you feel, it must be true. Not even just it's, you account there is completely the side of, me having any chance of this thing be bought by anybody is completely skipped, and that tells you the degree of alienation from reality that these people are. The sad thing is that we're spreading it to the masses because, again, the masses are ever more radically, more morally and culturally underdeveloped, and therefore we can't afford to create these bots that are fundamentally just, moving at a direction, at command, without even with a minimal, tiny emotional input, and not having any resistance on their own. This is the moment historically when somebody who has a very high moral strength arrives there and is capable of taking over the world system. And partly it's the same thing, because of course this is also produced, this is also engineered, right? It's not just, it happens again. There is always somebody that is immediately eager to exploit. And again, if you spot that, this is the moment which you can't just sit there and say, okay, well, I hope it's gonna go well, and then the whole world collapses in front of you and say, oh, well, maybe I should have done something in the middle. And you're part of the problem at that point. So I think these are really crucial topics because they evidence the misery of what is happening, the misery of the individuals, and the necessity of understanding reality ever better. There doesn't seem to be an interest in reality. If you're old enough to remember this, but just think of how it was just 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, if we had been told what the world would have become with the degree of a dependency on social networks, or the how in fact our war cognitive reality. We're not talking even about the ideologies. Of course, they are crazy and radical and idiotic, and that would have probably mind blown us that much, because of course that's much more important. Even in a sense, if we had been told, look, we will fundamentally just live already within a machine. To the degree we even forget about anything else, right? And completely, even this thing would have surpassed any kind of concern we had before about anything else as it's factually happening. Because even the climate change, the consumeristic thing, is that everybody kind of maybe has a negative opinion of that, but is completely engaged in it all the time, because the social networks are exclusively based on the complete carelessness for any real, any problem, first of all, of these ones, but also any understanding of reality in that at the same time. That's part of the same game, right? There would have been a revolt. There would have been an enormous political upheaval. People would have said, we do not want to fall in that. 20 years later, here we are. and we're doing nothing about it, right? So this is crazy. People are becoming crazy because, again, as before, yes, there is also a big deal of of individual responsibility, but still we are also fooling ourselves in pretending that even just all these mental illness epidemics is just random, or it happens for some strange reason because we have been habituated to make moral relativism about anything and saying, well, we don't really know, right? The causes are complex, meaning I don't know shit about what we're talking about because I didn't make the minimal effort to understand anything, or even starting with reading a word about the whole thing, or even using common sense or logic or rationality for that matter. And so you can make anybody buying anything, and we have lost control. I think we have arrived to a point where this problem probably will. There are chances it will be fixed, right? It's just we don't know how, right? Whether it will be surpassed by something else that is even worse at that level, or maybe there will be some phenomena worldwide that will shake us at the point of saying, let's realize that this has been a very serious issue, that we haven't taken measures, and that we've been fooled, and we are essentially handing over our even I would say, that I don't have a positive bias towards freedom per se, right? I am mostly about liberty, because of course there must be of it, but here we have been completely hijacked by criminal ideology. So freedom as a starter, right? It should be reinstated in ways that we didn't think we could even minimally hand over, again, after a very few time before, and that happened instead. And this seems now to not being even. I mean, there is somebody talking about these things, but it seems as if they would be default under attack. And you know what I'm talking about, generally speaking, from a political point of view. And yes, I do believe that. I think, of course, that the world is, as I was saying before, more complex to be caged in these frames, etc. But again, never underestimate what you can do to the masses when they're morally weak, right? This is something that in the last year or so, I've historically speaking, I've reflected dramatically on. It seems to me that it's of much more disturbing proportions that we have thought. And the reason being, as I was saying before, is that the ideal dimension has been completely erased from our historical understanding. It seems as if, when we have to explain any historical phenomena, we say, it happened probably because of the crop rate, or it probably happened because of climate change. It happened probably because, I don't know, wealth was distributed in this way rather than another. But we have stopped even reading what the sources that are human beings like us, that are after all are concerned about the same problems that we're concerned today, that are actually telling us. And we can easily see from actually a political and military evidential history that we have completely taken it away from the equation in some way. At least if not, at least in maybe just as kind of a purely administrative, procedural, or kind of even in there non-comparative or diachronic and unframed and more comprehensive dimension of moral reality is concerned. And so we are immediately habituated to believe that it's not just about what humans do, what individuals do to change the world, and how they do it, and how they can do it in the best as much as in the worst ways, and that it's happening all around us constantly, all the time. And that's where most problems actually stem from. No, it must have been kind of a factor, and this is, that if you change, you fix the problem. And this fits pretty much also a certain political view that we're used to cope with. in our daily lives, and this idea that it's even about the presumption that we know the world system at large. I wonder, that on Schwerpunkt, I talk very much about this historical perspective. Excuse me, I drink a little. In this kind of, the problem, in fact, of the lack of a comprehensive understanding. But this is properly about, in fact, that speaks for the level of complete ignorance towards history. Even academically, we know that history is that complex. It's basically the first thing that qualifies a true scholar in history. Even the people like me who just finished just a doctorate or something, like we just know it, because it's that level of, that immediate level of complexity you can be acquainted with just already at that level without decades of experience of research and teaching, that simply discloses itself in front of your eyes constantly. If you have never presented with this story, if you think that history is just about long complex processes, that it's a matter of how you see the thing, and if you don't actually substantiate what happened, even just from a factual evidential point of view, you're done for. Of course, cultural Marxism took over Western academies after World War II. There were all the reasons for that, as you can understand. But that bias, sadly, and it's dying, at least in some. This is very complex, actually, as an idea. We'll talk about it another time. But let's say, still as a legacy, what happens is that even those who don't buy into the ideology have still been presented with a way of explaining a history that resents of that kind of materialistic view, and that kinds of decided to forcefully expel any idea that there was somebody wanting to change in the world and actually doing it, because they were morally superior, because they had a system of values that managed to encompass the world, where other people were just, and very often the same masses that pushed for those materialistic revolutions, this ferocious and radical elimination of any valuable cultural approach. So I'm very surprised by how this is still somewhat. I give you that. It's obvious that when you start studying history at the beginning, you need these kind of approximations, but it's the mechanism, somewhat the depersonalization, which is typical of Marxism, in a true dehumanization and subpersonal way, that has deprived even, in fact, Western intellects from this capacity of believing in themselves, because that's exactly the purpose of Marxism, and it's always been. They never cared about men. There is no such thing like men for Marxists. There's just a purpose that fundamentally substantiates itself in a materialistic rearrangement of reality. It costs whatever it takes, right? And this is, there would be a lot to talk about that. I got interested very often in my life about these things, and even from a historical point of view, the history of the Soviet Union especially is one of my favorite topics. And that's the problem. We have told, in order even to criticize historical communism, we have used the same tools that the Marxists provided us with. It's a way of cultural hegemony, the same Marx did. And instead, what the way that solves this whole thing is the reintroduction of the sacred, is the reintroduction of humanity in its deeper sense, which is a moral one. And of course, that is the first victim of any totalitarian regime in general, and that were in fact all of socialist matrix in a way or another, inflamed from even when they were pretending to be something universalistic, even still from an ethno-nationalistic way, in ways that were not flattering a greater understanding of reality, but the lowest, the most animal-like instincts of man. And so because those are the forces that the revolution uses, right? That's quite quite evident. Even if you study Leninism, what do you think Lenin knew, how to carry out the revolution and what people had to be turning to, and this is, I think, a great part of the problem. In fact, I'm very open to talk about these things, even properly from a history of thought and even of religion, because there can't really be a world where you presume that there is not a religion going on at any moment, and that is not really a problem. It depends just on what religion it is that really makes the difference, and how adherent to reality it is. And the differences are astonishing. So it's very convenient to oppose even, let's say, theism to anti-theism, as if anti-theism wasn't kind of a religion itself, and just a much more remarkably underdeveloped one. But even in that sense, this is a huge topic. And again, there are chances that we will take this forward. I presume there are lots of strange things that are happening with Schwerpunkt here, and I will talk to you about if I reach the 5,000 subscribers, which is kind of how many, like 11 subscribers away at the moment, that I will try to propose you in a much more concrete sense, because the historical base will remain. As I just said, there can't be any concrete effort in that sense without the historical base, but still it's about what this history should be about, right? And so the point of this video was actually stimulating people to look at what they believe and why they believe in it, or even if they believe in it, because it starts all with that, right? People presume to believe something because they presume to understand, they presume to have a certainty. They mostly don't, right? There is something atrocious in saying I actually believe in something, because it really depends, right? Especially, well, I believe in say, it depends on the magnitude of what you believe in, right? So some statements are paradoxically, it's not much what you believe in without knowing, but say how much you're willing to believe, in fact, without. That's faith, right? And faith is driven by certain tracks. At a certain point, you can't see the end of. But if you have understood that you know the direction of, you're willing to bet. That's where the majority of moral forces stem from. So when you dump reality down, which the overwhelming amount of ideologies fundamentally have been created in probably the last 200 years, and in fact appealed mostly to the masses, and so that they are the most common ones, actually are, well, the weaker from a moral point of view you will become. And that's the trick. In fact, I was telling you before, it's the illusion, it's scientism. Like just a jerk like Dawkins could even say that scientism is a way to go against after science, right? It's just like saying sexism is like going against rapists, right? You shouldn't use that word. That's the unspeakable level of radical moral and scientific inferiority that we have arrived to, and that's the reason why so many people buy in that bullshit, because they don't even know what they're talking about in the first place. They never made an effort. And those are the kind of figures that people, even look up to, as if, you should even look up to anybody for that matter, instead of being hyper concentrated on what you are doing at every single moment to be a better person. And so beware of that, right? Never think that, because you know that things do not work, because when you say something that doesn't work, or you do something wrong, and you realize, even maybe you had a motivation at that point, and maybe even you came to rationally convince yourself at some point it's not the case. I don't know how it works for you, but for me, it's immediately a red light. There is something there that says, wait, don't do it. There is something wrong. At least think about this again. Are you sure of that? what do you have there to actually believe in that is true, and that, or at least, you hope that can make you bet on it, because it's always a matter of betting on it. You can never be fully sure about anything, but at some point you should start doing things by realizing that by a certain knowledge you're able to turn the odds in your favor ever more easily. And of course this brings you further to achieve more, and at that point again the system is more complex, and so the bet becomes actually always riskier, right? So it's an illusion that you can again secure your life in the absence of risk and suffering and failure. And I think, you see, isn't it beautiful, right? Isn't it more beautiful to live a life where you are actually, that even you're going to suffer in a way, and when you suffer, it's awful. It's obvious. It's what everybody says. But when you stop, when you manage to overcome, which is not always the case, right? There are terrible things that can happen in your life, especially if they are kind of random and out of your control. Those are things that, we are susceptible to our mortality and limitations in ways that it's always too late than we can hope. But isn't it more beautiful to see that as that challenge? Saying, okay, I will go into it. I will fight for it. That is what really brings you there. That really brings you to believe in yourself, because if you don't, you can't even take the challenge. And saying, okay, well, either I succeed or I will fail in the effort, but it will have been worth to know something out of this more, to become a better person and to be more aware of the world. And so to do better next time. I think that is crucial. That is fundamental, and that's the level of motivation that we need. Not aiming at happiness, which first of all would be like a mental disease. Like if you presume to be a forever happy person, that's something for, you go into a psychiatric clinic, because it's not normal. First of all, human beings are not designed for that. Secondly, how do you even fool yourself to the point, in fact, morally and scientifically, for the case that is even possible. It's not that you're aiming at something that is the right thing, but that, it just takes there more, let's say, more effort for it. You're simply settling for something that is not the purpose. You're incapable of seeing anything that fundamentally is not you, and your limits as your as the point of it all, while we are surrounded by the evidence that is not the case, and that we should, instead of entrenching within ourselves, opening and going there and fight. And it's hard, but isn't it worth it? Alright, so for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.